my topic, which is around the crisis of civilisation, the expansion of industrial capitalism in Africa, demographics to do with global warming in Africa, the World Bank, and the coal energy sectors in South Africa, and trying to condense that all into 15 minutes has been a very, very challenging task. So, and my husband's written on the top of what I'm saying to talk slowly, so I think I've got an impossible task. If we go to the second slide. Basically, I'm really covering the South Africa's global warming vulnerability, just having a look at some of the demographics, how the neoliberal industrial capitalist model of development is exacerbating the problem in Africa. And there's a lot of evidence of the disastrous mix of coal, electricity, political and economic power, global warming and the spread of industrial capitalism in Africa. And the World Bank, the international institutions are right in there. And we'll look just very briefly at the World Bank, a very recent World Bank loan to South Africa for coal-fuelled electricity. If we can go to the next one. Few demographics on Africa, and I suggest you just read through them on your own, but one to draw attention to is that the African population of Africa will double to over 2 billion by 2050. Of that, 70% of people will be 1.2 billion will be urban dwelling, and of that 70% will be living in slums. And life in slums, I visited some of the slums in South Africa, which is one of the wealthiest countries in Africa. Life in the slums is pretty horrific. In South Africa, just if you want to just run through the demographics, I think if you go to the next slide. For example, in 2008, over 250,000 people died from AIDS. The year before it was 350,000. A lot of these deaths are tied into the minerals energy complex and the structure of society. In South Africa in 2008, there were over 5 million refugees. We were in the north of South Africa last year, and there were 1,000 people crossing the border a day. The problem of refugees in Africa and South Africa is absolutely enormous, and it's going to be exacerbated by global warming. Looking at, in the next slide, Africans together produce 1 tonne per capita of carbon emissions. The average globally is around 4.3 tonnes. Australia and the US is about 20 tonnes per capita. Within South Africa produces 73% of Africa's carbon emissions, and of that, it's less than 5% of the population are responsible for that 73%. Much of the emissions are coming from the minerals energy complex. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2007, talked about the importance of adaptive capacity, saying it was an absolute necessity. However, much of Africa and South Africa have no further adaptive capacity. People are living on the edge now. The next. As I said, South Africa has one of the highest levels of carbon emissions, and yet 30% of the population has no access to electricity. In rural areas in South Africa, this could be up to 80%. Emissions for South Africa will quadruple by 2050. The government is on a business as usual development program, helped being written after 1994 when the first democratic elections were being held by the World Bank formulating their economic policies very much along neoliberal industrial capitalist model. The South African political elite, however, at negotiations on global warming and what South Africa's emissions trajectories should be, talk about the need for industrial development for the sake of the impoverished population. However, it's a case of a position of hiding behind the poor. Looking more closely at South Africa's energy, coal constitutes more than 70% of energy in South Africa. The parastatal, Eskom, and a parastatal is a state corporation basically. It does have some privatised parts to it, but it is nevertheless the South African government's energy institution. Produces 95% of electricity for South Africa and 45% of the electricity for sub-Saharan Africa. It's a hugely powerful institution. They produce electricity for below cost to the mining sector. And BHP Billiton, which is one of the companies which was very vocal over the super profits tax in Australia, was receiving electricity well below the cost of what it takes to produce it. In many of the townships, electricity is not only more expensive than what it is for the mining companies, but it's in the hundreds of percentage points more expensive. Just going to Eskom, and I might just go to my notes here to Eskom was established in the 1920s to deliver cheap and abundant electricity primarily to the mining and industry, what has become known as the minerals energy complex. One of the interesting things that in Australia there's very little research into the minerals energy complex, and I think it's one reason being that our universities are so captured by the corporate sector. But in South Africa there is some very good research being done on that sector, and we could learn a lot from that here. Eskom has been described as an institutional giant on the African continent, driving and shaping much of the economic and energy power restructuring, which is currently taking place in collaboration with the South African state and South African private capital. In this role, South Africa acts as a sub-imperial power, a role which reflects its enormous political and economic power, its determinative role in other countries' economic development trajectories. South African state and private capital are the main drivers of global industrial capitalism on the African continent. And some of the details around that, there's not time to go into today, but are extremely worrying. In 2007 and 2008, if we can go to the... Very good. Was hit by an energy crisis, resulting in major power supply interruptions. A secret Eskom dossier was presented in Parliament this year that revealed that Eskom had been supplying electricity to a number of multinational companies, including BHP, Billiton, Anglo American and some of the world's giant companies, well below the cost of electricity production. The person that revealed this information was taken to task, but nothing was said about the multinationals. The secret sweetheart deals were sewn up just prior to the transition to democracy in 1994, and the contracts were drawn up for in excess of 40 years for some of them, and contracts which carried hefty penalties for contract termination. BHP Billiton's secret pricing deal, for example, has enabled it to power its massive aluminium smelters for the international market. And the company's 3 aluminium smelters contribute something around 0.1% to the GDP, but are significant contributors to Africa's carbon emissions. In fact, there are allegations that bauxite is shipped from Australia to South Africa and processed and returned to Australia to take advantage of the cheap subsidised electricity. In other words, South Africa is exporting cheap electricity. But to return to Eskom's power shortage woes, Eskom embarked on a 60 billion Australian dollar expansion program over 5 years to 2013, seeking funding loan from the World Bank. And despite a concerted effort by more than 200 international civil society organisations, including 60 from South Africa, the World Bank approved a nearly $4 billion loan in April 2010. The majority of the loan is for completing what will be 2 of 4 of the world's most polluting coal-fired power stations. The main beneficiaries of the loan will be the multinationals, and the debt falls squarely on civilians and future generations' shoulders. There are numerous counts for criticising the loan, no matter whether you do it from a Marxist framework or a neoliberal theoretical framework. But just for a few points, the loan is dollar-based, so that if the rand, which is the South African currency, weakens in relation to the dollar, the most likely scenario, the size of repayments will increase. It also means that Eskom, or the South African government, which underwrites the loan risk, has to earn foreign currency to repay the loan. This also means that there is yet further entrenchment of the export-oriented economy in raw materials, an economic model that has consistently failed to eradicate poverty in the country. And one of the things that is very characteristic of African economies, is the rape and pillage of the mineral resources. There's also an inherent paradox in Eskom as securing a loan that both requires an export-oriented economy based on cheap extraction of raw minerals, and which in turn requires cheap electricity. There's a flow-on effect from this loan, a rush to open new coal mines, and Australian companies are very closely involved in this. And there's one company, Coal of Africa, which was born in Western Australia, and its board executives, some of them were educated at Curtin and UWA and so on, and they are involved in this rush for more coal mining in Africa, and that's got huge implications for the environment and for the economy in Africa. The World Coal Institute estimates that there are more than 847 billion tonnes of proven coal reserves worldwide, enough coal to last more than 130 years at current rates of production, a short time for human history, but a long time for global warming. Sorry, I've just got myself lost. In light of the, there are many aspects to this, and I think because of the time frame, I think I'd rather spend the time discussing or answering questions. I'd like to just finish very quickly by saying something, giving a quote from the 2010 Pan-African Climate Justice Manifesto, because in Australia we hear so little from the Africans' perspective on global warming. And the quote goes, "Africa stands on the front line of climate change. Across our continent, in villages, in towns, on coastlines and deep in the heart of Africa, people battle daily with a growing climate crisis. Our rivers run dry, our crops turn to dust, seasons shift and change. The effects of climate change are reflected in the expectant eyes of hungry children, in the lengthening footsteps of women carrying water. Across Africa, a growing congregation of people suffers starvation and disease, while others, after freeing themselves from the grip of grinding poverty, are shackled again by an increasingly hostile climate. It is a cruel irony indeed that a people who have lived for so long in harmony with nature, imprinting the lightest of carbon footprints on the earth, are now suffering and living in abject poverty due to the damaging effects of greenhouse gases emitted by developed countries. The effects of climate change are real. We are seeing the consequences, but they are not of our making. For over 2 centuries, the industrialised world became wealthy by drenching the atmosphere in carbon. They plundered resources from every region of the world. On mountains of coal and oil, they built cities of plenty. In great buildings they constructed while triggering the climate crisis, they shelter from its effects. Those left outside are now told, seek another path to prosperity, while the sun beats down, or a perfect storm, not of their making, gathers on the horizon. I think I'll finish there, and I'm sure that there's been a lot of discussion. As I said, I'm sorry not to have been longer at the conference, but looking at what are the answers, how do you link? There are a lot of very good initiatives in Africa and South Africa at local levels, community levels. These 2 women, I relate to them rather well because they're grandmothers, as I am, are able to grow food on about 500 square metres. They grow enough for themselves, for their families, to contribute to their communities, which have very high unemployment rates, HIV, AIDS and so on. They need very little infrastructural support. The World Bank, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Bill Gates Foundation are pouring billions into agriculture, for example, in Africa. There's a lot of private, large-scale industrial farming, which has taken over land from the small-scale farmers throughout Africa. But there is counter-movements, but the power is not with them. Global institutions, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations with its neoliberal economic policies are disastrous for Africa. Within Africa, there's a lot of disappointment for people here who are as old as I am and were involved in the anti-apartheid struggle. We saw that we had a lot of hopes in the transition government, but the transition was a political transition. The economy stayed very much in the hands of the global and local elite, the minerals energy complex, the financial sector. The elite in Africa now, there's a small percentage of black elite, but it is still very much a class situation. And nationalisation is not an answer in Africa because the state is so corporatised and corrupt. The market has clearly failed the people in South Africa, and there's a need to shift the power back to the people. How that is to be done, I think probably people at this conference is something that you have some suggestions and answers for, but I'll leave it at that. Thank you.